the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway E2 class. Finally I can discuss this. I'm gonna be real with you, I'm pretty sure the E2 has been my most requested train to talk about ever. I get so many comments about the E2 and why I need to put it on the list. You gotta put this one on the list. It's great. You need it. It's so important to talk about this. And, part of me gets it because this train is not great. But it's also associated with arguably the most famous fictional train ever created, Thomas the Tank Engine. And I'll speak, from experience. I grew up watching Thomas. I love Thomas the Tank Engine. I, introduced it to my son. I mean, Thomas is a great series. Brilliant. Absolutely, without question. Reverend W. Awdry wrote a great series of children's books that turned into just this awesome children's series that, will be enjoyed for years to come, I hope. And it's probably responsible for getting me involved in trains. So, in terms of its design, I think we're looking at one of the most influential trains in history. But does that make it a good engine? Well, here's my thing. When people started first pointing this out, I knew the E2 wasn't great, but people were talking it's top 5 material. And the reason I put it low on the list is that compared to a lot of the trains I've talked about before and am going to discuss, the E2, okay, it's not good, but it's not terrible. The E2 came into being back in the early 1900s. They were delivered from the manufacturer between 1913 and 1914. Now, their initial run, they did have an immediate issue in that their water supply, which tank engines carry on board because they don't have tenders, was inefficient. There just wasn't enough to keep it going for a reasonable amount of time before having to top off again. So it was remodeled into a second series that expanded the water tanks to make it a little bit better. And that did fix that problem. However, the E2s never got around another issue, which is its coal bunker. The coal bunker on the E2s is just too small, much like the water tanks were. But for whatever reason, never actually expanded on it. And the result was that every time they went to do anything with it, it just couldn't hold up. It always needed to go back for coal way too soon. So, even though Thomas in the series is known for having his own branch line, the E2 was, tried on branch lines in real life, and it absolutely could not do it, because they were too long. Even a branch line was too long. They did eventually get tasked with shunting duties later on, and they were pretty decent at that, as tank engines tend to be, but even there, they weren't exactly great at it, because they were very long for tank engine standards. They had a 16-foot wheelbase, and compared to some of the other tank engines they were using, whether it be the S100s or the Austeri 060 saddle tanks, which had 10-foot and 11-foot wheelbases respectively, it meant that there were parts of the yards that the E2 couldn't go where the other two could. So what I'm saying is, the E2 just never seemed to be able to do anything particularly well as a result of all these faults. Now, that being said, I still don't feel comfortable sitting here saying that it's one of the worst trains ever, even though I put it on the list, because, only 10 were produced, and they were weaker than most of the other tank engines in, most categories because of their efficiency issues, but they must have found some level of use for them, because they stayed around for most of the 20th century. They weren't withdrawn until the early 60s. Nearly 50 years, they were still using them. So it wasn't like they were bad enough to be scrapped or anything. But, at the same time, Thomas's, origins, much like Boco's, aren't exactly the greatest. But you have to admit, it's the most iconic design ever. I mean, look at it. It's just a cute-looking engine. I mean, it's totally appropriate for the series. So you gotta give it that much, I suppose. Sorry, Thomas. Nothing against you, man. In your universe, you're great. In our universe, not so much. Great Eastern Railway Class A55. Oh, look, another tank engine. I'll be real, there's actually a lot of British stuff on here. Hopefully no British Rail. But it's a lot of early stuff. I keep getting requests for, British things. I don't know whether you guys hate yourselves or what, or if it's just a thing. I'm not trying to pick on Britain with this part. It just dawned on me as I'm doing this. I'm like, wait, all of these are related to Britain somehow. Well, almost all of them, not quite. But, you know, most of the list, so I don't know. But Britain had a long history with rail, and there were a ton of different designs, so of course a lot of them are going to be questionable. You know, they can't get it right every single time. Lord knows we didn't do it right over here in America or anywhere else for that matter. Like, you know, people mess up. It's okay. But the A55 is a weird one because, technically speaking, it is an experimental engine, so you can kind of forgive it a little bit because it was designed to do a very, 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 very specific thing, and they only ever made one of it. It was an O10 tank engine. 10 driving wheels on a tank engine, which is pretty big. And in fact, at the time when it was created, which was in 1902, it was one of the largest engines, you know, especially of its type, on the British rail lines. The result of this is that you had a lot of power, but you also had something that was extremely heavy. And the A55 was very heavy. But it was designed to do something very specific, and that's to test how quickly they could get an engine to accelerate. It was designed specifically to accelerate extremely fast, and yeah, the A55 could accelerate really, really, really fast. No question about it, and could do nothing else but that. The problem with it was that most of its other elements weren't exactly the most efficient, especially for the needs of the time, but the bigger issue was, like I said, its weight. It was heavy. A lot of the bridges on the rail lines at that time would not have been able to take an engine that weighed as much as the A55 did. Had it been created, 30 years later, maybe the bridges could have held up, but even at that, the point was that this was an experiment to test something, and yeah, it did it, but they just couldn't figure out how to use it for anything useful. Like, yeah, it could accelerate, great, wonderful. Can we actually do anything with that? And the answer was, not really, no. In its defense, it was later rebuilt into a tender engine, an 080, and it did serve after that. However, it didn't even do that great even when it was rebuilt. It was no more capable than the Class G58s they were using at the time. So they didn't bother to build any more of it because it wasn't doing anything better. Or even worse, it's kind of there. It was scrapped in 1913. New Zealand Railways GClass. Okay, this is a weird one. Because, well, from the get-go, my viewers in North America may be a little alarmed at this engine's peculiar design, but I want to stress this. This engine's issues have nothing to do with its weird layout, and this is not unusual outside of North America. What you're looking at is a Garrett type of locomotive. The layout was invented by Herbert William Garrett. He was a British engineer, and it's an articulated locomotive that's split into 3 parts as opposed to 2 like tenders, or 1 if you're a tank engine. The unique thing about Garrett's is they kind of have 2 tenders, and the driving wheels are actually under what you would consider the tenders on this type of engine. This means that Garrett's tend to have very even weight distribution and pretty decent tractive effort. The tenders often hold water and coal respectively, depending on how they're laid out. Every one is different. And there's quite a number of these. They had a lot of success with this type of locomotive, particularly in locations like Africa and Asia, who really enjoyed it. For whatever reason, North America never really got around to enjoying this type of locomotive. I think they were concerned about safety issues with them, because seeing forward is a little bit more difficult on this type of train when compared to a normal steam engine layout. But even so, it's a unique engine. And some of the Garretts are actually very good. Like I said, this has nothing to do with any issues with the type itself. This has to do with the G classes specifically. Under the white notation, they'd be a 462 plus 264. They were unique even for Garretts as they were one of the few to employ 6 cylinders, and a mechanical stoker was used to feed coal into the locomotive. At the time, New Zealand was looking to incorporate some new engines on their lines. They invited the Bayer, Peacock and Company of England to suggest suitable engines for them, and they recommended, in fact insisted upon, these Garrett types. And this was, according to the New Zealand government railways themselves, against their own better judgment. With the way these locomotives were designed, they were powerful, but that was kind of their problem. New Zealand tracks were not up to snuff compared to England or even America. There were a lot of rural lines that were put down a little more haphazardly, so anything that had too much power on top of them tended to damage the rails, which the G-Class did, repeatedly. The drawbars on the rolling stock broke wherever the engines ran, no matter what. And they were also incredibly hot, which steam engines tend to be, but they generated such intense heat that in the restricted tunnels, which were more common in New Zealand at the time, the crews hated them because they were dying of heat exhaustion every time they went into a tunnel on these things. They were withdrawn pretty quick, but they couldn't just scrap them. They'd spent a lot of money getting them there, so they were rebuilt as Pacific-type locomotives, 462 tenders. However, even in this case, they weren't great. I mean, they were better, but they weren't great. They stayed in service for a few decades, but they had issues with adhesion, and they also had a habit of having steam leaks. However, this could be attributable to lack of maintenance, because according to many, if the G-Class was kept up to snuff with constant repairs, they ran fine, but they were still highly unpopular and never gained ground when it came to that territory. Overall, the whole thing became just a total disaster. And I kind of hate the fact that I have to talk about the Garretts in this light, because like I said, that type of locomotive should not be blamed for the G-Class's issues. It's just happens to be the first time I get to talk about a Garrett. And this is where I get a bunch of comments saying, actually, it's pronounced Garrett or something, because I'm reading and I'm America. Yeah, I get it. It's Malay, not mallet. And the big boy isn't a mallet either. It's a simple articulated locomotive, and I can't get a source that tells me the truth anymore. This is the problem with the internet, people. Everyone lies to you, but I try not to. Okay? I'm trying here. Promise. The British Rail Class 22. When will the torment end? Is really my issue at this point. It's just... this is eternal. I don't even have a proper explanation anymore. It's just one of these things with you. If it is 1960s and it's British Rail, it's probably bad, is what I'm trying to say. It's not always true, but it feels that way. It really does. The Class 22, okay. Here's the thing about the Class 22. Compared to a lot of the other British Rail diesels I've talked about, this was diesel hydraulic, just so we're clear, it wasn't awful, but it had the same old issues that every single diesel they ever put out during this time had, which is, upon delivery, they were awful. Drive motors were unreliable at best, and their transmissions barely functioned. And, in this case, they couldn't actually be returned to the North British Locomotive Works who actually built the things, because a contractual agreement that apparently British Rail signed for whatever reason said that no, any problems the diesels have are suddenly yours, buyer beware, I guess, which is insane to me. However, the Class 22 should be noted as another example of a diesel that British Rail brought into the fold that started out really terrible, that actually got better. Because they had to repair it themselves, they did that. And they actually repaired them fairly well. They were introduced in '59, and by 1961, their reliability had improved a great deal. The problem then was that more powerful Hymex and warship types of diesels were available that could do the same job, but way better. So, unfortunately, the Class 22 was thrown onto secondary duties. But in its defense, again, it did actually perform those duties pretty well, with availability being rated at about 85%, which is a far cry from like every other diesel I've ever talked about under British Rail. So, can you consider it one of the worst? Well, yes, because it started out that way, but like some of the ones I do talk about, this is one that did get better. So, even though I put you on the list, I think you deserve a bit of a pass. You got a bad lot, and no one took care of you. And when someone finally did, it did your job fairly well. So, compared to the other diesels, I think Class 22 deserves a little bit of love is all I'm trying to say. Turbojet trains. By multiple people, actually. I'm gonna throw all these in the same lot, because some people say this is only a Russian idea, and doing further research, no, that's not true. They weren't even the first to attempt this. That was over here in America. That was us. Hi, take a look at this. This is a high-speed rail car with, well, what are those? Why, those appear to be two jet engines strapped on top of it. This is the M497 Black Beetle, and it was an experimental jet-powered railcar testbed that was used by New York Central Railroad in 1966. Those engines are actually supposed to be used for Convair's B-36 Peacemaker intercontinental bomber, and for some reason New York Central was like, you know, what if we strapped a jet engine to a train? And the result is questionable. The Russians would later also do this by taking the engines off of their Yak-40, but also apply it to a high-speed rail car, and do pretty much the same thing. In fact, they look remarkably similar. They weren't even the only two that did this. Now, these were all test beds trying to get the technology to see if it worked, and, you know, gonna be real, it didn't. It didn't really at all. Well, it did in some ways. In terms of all being high speed, yeah, they were fast. They were very, very fast. They're jet engines, of course they are. You strap a jet engine to something and turn them on, yeah, that thing's gonna get to good speed, and they did get up to pretty good speed. Both of these designs exceeded 160 to 180 miles per hour, which was very fast for a train in those days. But the designs had a couple issues. A, there's already ways to make trains fast. The Japanese, again, proved this with their high-speed rail line. It didn't involve strapping jet engines to something like your Wile E. Coyote trying to catch the Roadrunner, okay? Like, there's a way more efficient way to do this. And that's leading into the other issue, that these are jet engines. And jet engines love to consume fuel. They are not very economical. The only reason they get away with it on planes is that planes require that kind of speed to maintain their lift. And because the speed and flying, you know, over obstacles is something planes are, you know, very good at because it's exactly what they're for, you can make ticket prices high enough to compensate for the fuel costs that you get on aircraft. But with a train, it doesn't really fly so well. Not only are there better ways to make a train go that fast, but you're never gonna get the public to pay for a train that consumes all the fuel in the universe because you strapped a couple of jet engines to it. It just isn't going to work. Now, in some ways, these designs were a little successful because they did gain a ton of data when it came to trains traveling at high speeds that, you know, could improve other train designs. So it wasn't like they were totally worthless in the end. But they did have another issue that if they were ever put into commercial service, that was never ever going to be solved. And that issue was the issue with this idea. It's not just the fuel, you see. There's something else about jets that you should probably be... Hold on. Look. Jet engines are loud. They are very loud. Even not involving sonic booms when they're, you know, traveling fast in the sound like the Concorde did. Jet engines are noisy. And if they're on the ground, they're making a lot of noise. People get annoyed living next to airports and hearing jets all the time. I mean, I don't. I love planes. We can talk about planes sometime if you want. But there's always noise complaints about this thing. Can you imagine how many people would whine if you had a screaming banshee of a train traveling down the rails every single day, right next to their homes, shaking their windows? It's a jet engine that was supposed to be mounted to an intercontinental bomber that was designed to haul nuclear bombs. Look, I admit, the mad science going on here is pretty cool, but there's no way to make this a reasonable option, is what I'm trying to say. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.